I'm Sarah Ruderman Wilensky from PJ Library, and we're so glad to have you all joining us for today's webinar, Talking with Children About Loss in the Age of Coronavirus. For those of you who have recently lost loved ones, we send you our deepest condolences. We grieve with you. We've had an overwhelming amount of interest in our talk today, with nearly 1,300 people registering to be here with us. And more than 300 of you have submitted questions in advance. We will do our very, very best to address as many of those questions as possible during our time together today. And for those of you who aren't able to have your questions answered, we are going to be sure to send out lots of resources in the coming week, as well as a recording of this webinar, so that if you'd like to share it with friends, those who weren't able to be here live today, or if you'd like to view it again, you'll be able to do that. If you have additional questions that develop during our webinar today, we ask you to use the Q&A function that you can see at the bottom of your screen, Q&A with two little talking bubbles there. And that way our team here will be able to see the questions that you enter and answer them in a really calm and orderly fashion. I'm incredibly fortunate to have colleagues on the call with me today, Meredith Lewis, Carla Nomberg, and Duncan Gilman, who are going to help move the questions along, help with any kind of a technical issue you might be having, so that we're able to really devote our attention to this incredibly important topic. So thank you to my incredible colleagues. I want to mention as we're starting that we really specifically called this webinar Talking with Children about this issue because it's an ongoing conversation. It's one that is evolving over time. So to that end, I'm so fortunate to welcome my colleague, Rabbi Melanie Levav, to join us. Melanie is our director of PJ Library in New York, and she comes to us with a background as a rabbi, chaplain, and social worker. And I have a background in education, specifically early childhood education, children 0 to 7, and child development. On top of all of that, Melanie and I are both parents to PJ Library and PJ Our Way kids, so we're really in the thick of it with all of you. Melanie, how are you today? How's your family? Where are you? What's keeping you up at night?
Thanks, Sarah. I just want to make sure that you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Great. So I'm in New York City in an apartment building, in a high-rise building with my spouse, who's a 4th grade teacher, and our 2 kids who are 9 and 16 years old. Everyone's on Zoom school at the moment. We're using a lot of sound machines and noise-canceling headphones around here these days. What keeps me up at night now is the sadness and the overwhelming sense of loss my kids and so many of our kids are facing now, along with what we as parents are experiencing, the fears we have for ourselves, for our kids, and for our own parents. My son lost out on singing in his high school musical and playing on his baseball team, and my daughter's desperate to play with friends in person. And we're all living in fear about the likelihood that their camp is going to be canceled this summer. And yet I realize these losses, while real and overwhelming for our kids, aren't quite the same as the death that we're seeing in our city in particular. The pandemic has put the topic of death and dying in our collective consciousness in a way that we've never seen in our lifetimes. I heard that the question, how to write a will, is seeing much more traffic on Google these days than ever before. And just last week, there was a study showing that nearly half of all adults in New York City know someone who has died from COVID-19. That's a huge number. And it's an opportunity for us to think as parents about how we grapple with the topic of death and dying, about how we might talk about it with our kids. Our kids are already talking about it or signaling to us that it's on their minds in so many ways. Talking about death and dying more openly is something I've advocated for long before the current pandemic. But in the wake of this pandemic, it's become an issue that's crossed many more people's minds and in new ways. It's brought the need to take care of planning for all eventualities to a place of urgency. And it presents us with the opportunity to think about how we as parents want to live our lives, recognizing that no one gets to live forever. Talking about death is really talking about life, and we're so glad that so many of you are joining us here for this conversation. Given that you're also a PJ parent, I wonder, Sarah, how are you and your family? Where are you, and what's keeping you up at night?
Thanks, Melanie. I live outside of Boston, which has been another area that's been really hard hit with this virus early, and certainly not to the same extent as New York, but we're really feeling it. I live here with my spouse and our two children, who are 7 and 9 in the first and third grade. And we're grappling with what so many of you all are: how to work and parent when our normal resources aren't available to us, how to have open and honest conversations with our kids without overwhelming them with too much information. And it's tough. So while I too have long been an advocate for talking about death and dying openly and with children of all ages for a long time, right now we're just being inundated with experiences of loss that we and our children are not well equipped to handle. We have this concept of death, loss of loved ones, and then this other idea of the feelings we're having about schools being closed, events being canceled, vacations being canceled, life events, bar and bat mitzvahs. There's so much that's being canceled. We often in our minds think that we're holding these in separate buckets, but something we know about brain science is that our brains, as smart as they are, aren't always able to so clearly differentiate between these two experiences. And the reason that many of us are feeling so flooded, so overwhelmed with feelings that feel like grief and loss, even if we're not experiencing an actual death of a loved one, is because this is how our brain operates. It triggers the same kind of mechanisms in our brain as those kinds of loss. So we're experiencing this grief, this sense of loss that we really need to validate for all of us and for our kids. In normal times, our childhood experiences with loss prepare us for the bigger losses we'll experience later in life, right? There's a really good reason that so many early childhood classrooms and kindergarten classrooms have small pets like fish or frogs or some other kind of a rodent. It's both because it's important to teach children how to take care of other living things, and because it offers this natural opportunity to talk about and experience loss. And think about it like building a foundation for your house or building scaffolding. We have these little experiences with loss that prepare us for the next experiences with loss. You might then lose a family pet, a larger animal, a cat or a dog. You may lose an elderly relative, and this is sort of the natural occurrence of life. But right now, what I'm thinking about is that it's all turned upside down. We're not having these experiences in sort of the normal order that we're used to. And it's a really complicated time. So those are some things that are really, front of mind for me right now. And also the fact, I just want to say, I'm really feeling fortunate that my work affords me the opportunity to have this conversation with you right now, Melanie, and that it's giving us a meaningful framework for navigating this issue. The Jewish people are often referred to as the people of the book. And I feel that so acutely right now, personally and professionally, that telling stories helps us make sense of what's happening in our lives, that this is part of our Jewish tradition. And that's Torah, right? Torah is telling stories to help us make sense of what's happening in our lives. And our kids are doing this naturally already right now. They're doing it through dramatic play, through creating their own stories, and through asking questions. And I'm really seeing it all around me. And I'm glad that I have this Jewish grounding for a bit of a frame of reference. So that's what I'm sitting with right now.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So as we get deeper into the topic, and before we get to the different ways to have an age-appropriate conversation with kids, I wanted to address the question of why we need to talk about death and dying and why we need to do it early and often with our kids. This question is really aimed at the grown-ups here. Here's where it's helpful for parents, for grandparents, for adults to clarify our own beliefs. It's not dissimilar from the idea of putting on our own oxygen mask first in case of an emergency on an airplane. We as parents have made a commitment in some way to raise our kids connected to Jewish values and practices, even if we're not 100% sure about all of those things ourselves. And too many grown-ups are afraid to talk about death and dying. Some may hold the irrational fear that talking about it is going to hasten death. It's like when I was growing up, we used to whisper cancer a generation ago, and then we all learned that certain cancer has affected the Jewish community more than others, and now we're all sporting pink t-shirts for breast cancer awareness. There was an article recently put out by Bar-Ilan University in Israel claiming that our brains may even be hardwired from childhood to shield us from thinking about our own deaths. Not talking about it as a way to protect ourselves from the difficult feelings, and it makes sense. Yet we know that avoiding the topic only makes it harder to talk about when we're faced with it in our own families and in our communities, as so many of us are now. We're at the early stages of what's being called a death positive movement right now, in the United States at least, before the current pandemic. Books like Being Immortal by Atul Gawande and When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi have helped so many of us begin to have conversations with our loved ones about how they and about how we want to live, knowing that life is finite. The Jewish community has been a bit slower to catch on to this communal conversation about death and dying in the modern age, though. A century ago, death was much more present in everyday life. People died at home. Children lived in those homes and witnessed the end of life. But as our modern healthcare systems began to evolve, more people began dying in hospitals and other healthcare facilities like nursing homes, removing the experience of death from the home and from the neighborhood. I mean, in your own life, think about the number of people you know who've died somewhere other than home. So that's a little bit about why we're not talking about death even before the pandemic. You know, the question is, well, why should we be talking about death even before and after the pandemic? So, you know, I'm a firm believer in the more we talk about hard topics, the better we get at having the conversation. Kids learn about death in ways that we grown-ups fail to recognize. Think about the kid on the playground back when we'd go to playgrounds, or even in your backyards for those of you who have, who picks up a bug and smushes it, right? Talking about things at an age-appropriate level allows us to remove some of the fear and mystery about the topic. I know you're going to get to the ages and stages, Sarah, and talking about death in particular allows us to improve our ability to talk about life. That's us grown-ups, to live lives of greater connection and meaning, knowing that in some way we're all terminal. I once learned from a great Jewish scholar, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, about the challenge of talking about death with students, meeting with children. He said teachers, parents have experienced intimate things in life. It was his euphemism for procreative sex. Like, we can talk about things like that because we've experienced certain things in life, and we speak with our children about things that we know from experience in so many ways, like the birds and the bees. Yet no one has experienced what it feels like to die, he said. So it's impossible to teach about the topic from experience when so many other things we teach about from experience. Indeed, Jewish tradition is so full of rabbinic imaginings of what it might feel like to die, and they're just that, they're imaginings. We might imagine it could feel like this. I think it's important for parents in particular to give ourselves a little bit of slack on the topic, to encourage us to make death a more regular part of our conversations with our children, knowing that there may not be clear answers for so many of the questions that arise when we talk about death with our kids. Early and often is how I like to say it. We should talk about death with kids to help demystify the topic, to remove some of the superstitions, and that talking about death is not going to hasten death. It's not going to change the current moment. An anecdote to illustrate this point. I think back to when our daughter was in kindergarten, learning her letters. Each day there was a new letter. The kids learned to write the letters, big A, little a, draw a picture of a word, what begins with A. Well, on the day that the kids learned the letter D, you might imagine there were a lot of pictures of dogs and ducks that went home in the backpack. But our kid, who happens to be the grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors, came home with a drawing of a stick figure flat on its back. Big D, little d, what begins with D? Dead begins with D. My kid drew a picture of someone dead because that's what she knew. She's named for her Zadie, whom she never met, and her Bubby died when she was just 2 years old. In our family, we talk about Bubby and Zadie a lot, about their families keeping their memories alive and the memories of extended family who we never met alive. It's the talking about death in our family that helped me to recognize the opportunity to help other families to talk more openly about death and dying, to help more grown-ups avoid the crises that are inevitable when we don't know what mom's wishes were or what Uncle Joe would have wanted.
Thanks, Melanie. So much of what you just said really resonates with me. And we have a similar approach in our family. My husband and I both lost a parent when we were pretty young, and our daughter is named after both of them. So like what you were saying, you know, for us in our family, talking about death is talking about life, and talking about life is talking about death. They're so inextricably connected in that kind of way. And I think it has afforded us this situation where we have a bit of a vocabulary for this issue already, even if we're not in crisis mode, right? Like my kids for years, their whole lives have been hearing about Grandpa Eric and Grandma Shelley, even though they never got to know them. And I think that is really meaningful and helps give our kids a bit of context. And I would say, you know, as we're sharing these kind of general tips, I would encourage all of you out there to do that as well, to find those opportunities to have those casual conversations, to bring up those memories, to do a little bit of like dead person name dropping, and to be able to make it a safe topic to talk about with kids, but also, like Melanie was saying, with adults. There are a lot of us adults who aren't comfortable having these kind of conversations. So maybe that's like my charge to you all after this. Like after this call, go talk to someone about a dead person. Like just, you know, make it normal. Bring it into the world a little bit more in that kind of way.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's, you know, it's a chance for us also to clarify our own wishes if we haven't done the advanced care planning work, the you know, logistics side of it in terms of wills and healthcare proxies. And there are lots of guides out there online to do this kind of stuff. Things like 5 wishes, which I'll put a plug out for, and we'll share some of this stuff in the resources after the webinar. Before you get to the appropriate ways to talk about loss and death with kids, I wanted to point out 4 key concepts in understanding death that are relevant in different ways at every age. Many of the questions we received in advance were about, like, you know, the different concepts of death and the language that we use to talk about it. So we're going to speak about the language in a few different ways today. So to that end, you'll see up on the slide in front of you 4 different ways to understand death. And these are really important, and they're really basic. The first is that death is irreversible. It's permanent. When you smush the bug, that bug is unable to return back to where it came from, and it's not going to change. The idea of it being irreversible, once something dies, that's the end of its life. And we know that permanency is a difficult concept for younger kids, for sure. The second, death is final. All functioning stops with death. Breathing stops, hearts stop beating, the brain stops thinking. Sure, those of you who are scientists know they don't all stop at the same second, and some things go on a little bit longer than others when a body you know, stops working. But the idea is that it's final. Everything that makes something alive stops. The third idea is that it's inevitable. Death is universal for all living things. This, for me, gives a little bit of comfort. It may not give comfort for everyone, but lots of us are scared to go here. And in some way, the fact that death is inevitable helps to normalize it, to equalize it. We're all terminal, as I like to say. And the last is causality. What causes death? This is a little harder in the current moment because there are simply too many unknowns when it comes to COVID-19. But in most cases, before the pandemic, after the pandemic, there are things that we can speak about with children that cause death, and serious illness is certainly one of them.
Thanks, Melanie. I think keeping these 4 points in mind is really helpful as we have the rest of this conversation, and maybe we'll come back to this slide. And just as a reminder, you don't need to be, you know, furiously writing any of this down at home. We're going to send you our slides. We're going to send you all these kind of resources so you can really have this experience for yourself and be here, be present now. I encourage you to do that if you're able to. Before we launch more into these real specifics around ages and stages, and just to say, in the past week, Melanie and I have been going through the 300 or so questions that you all have submitted in advance, and really are trying to address as many of them as possible. And to know that this area of this sort of ages and stages was a big one, and we're really going to address that. And we're going to elaborate on some of the things that Melanie just said as well. So just so you sort of know what's coming. I always like to know what's coming. I like to be prepared in that kind of way. So looking back at these tips a little bit, these are elements that are really ageless. So we'll talk about specific developmental ages, but to say this applies to all children and all people you're in relationship with, really. This first piece I want to look at is the idea of listen and observe. A lot of your questions had to do with, I notice my child is acting in this way, or my child is asking these kind of questions. What do I do? So it made me think there's an idea that comes out of Reggio Emilia, Italy, which is renowned for its educational approach, especially in early childhood. And the founder of their early childhood initiatives there, Lorenzo Malguzzi, wrote a piece about the 100 languages of children. And I really love this concept. And what he was really saying, without really speaking specifically to it, alluding to, is that children communicate with us in so many different ways. Those of us who are parents, we know that our children's behavior speaks to us, that the questions they ask speak to us, that how they engage in an art project, how they dig in the dirt. These are all ways that they are communicating their internal lives to us. Even our very youngest children, our infants and our toddlers, think about all of the nonverbal communication our youngest children have to engage in with us because they don't have language, and we learn how to react to that. So right now, in this time, I think it's so crucial for us to be paying really close attention to both what our children say, but I think even more so, what they're doing, their behavior. And I had a lot of questions come in that said, my child is doing X, Y, Z, is it normal? And yes, it's normal. This is how we're all processing a stressful, sometimes traumatic experience. Irrelevant of whether your children have lost a loved one, their whole life has been turned upside down lately. So to better pay attention, to really hear what our children are saying, either through language or through their behavior, I would encourage you to try to find some times for real vulnerability. In my house, this works really well at bedtime. There's something about the dark. There's something about snuggling in bed with your kids where they're really open to having conversations. I found this too when I was in sort of like the rat race of driving the carpools and driving all around. There's something about your kids sitting in the back seat that they forget that you're there sometimes, and they talk about things and you're able to overhear it. And we're not having so much of that these days, but that time at bedtime, I think, is a really beautiful time to allow for questions. And I've been doing this with my kids at night, asking questions like, is there anything you want to talk about? Is there anything you heard or saw that you have questions about? Or also being able to bring up some behavior you're seeing and saying, I noticed when you were playing with your Lego minifigs today that they all were violently murdered. What's that about? And just to say, like, that's not inappropriate behavior. That's an okay way to play. And it's a way for us to be able to check in with our kids about where the root of that is. So our children are processing their feelings about loss and grief through their play, through their aggression, and other changes in behavior. A few of our neighbors have gotten puppets recently, and it's been so interesting for me to observe from a socially safe distance, of course, how these kids are sort of working out their feelings through these puppets. And sometimes it can feel safer to give voice to scary thoughts through a character, through a toy, through a puppet, through a stuffed animal. So if you're seeing this happen at home, just check in with it by using that kind of I noticed language. I noticed that, you know, Daisy Sue Puppet was feeling really sad about not being able to see her grandparents. I noticed, you know, any of those kind of things can lead into a more nuanced conversation. And even for our very young children who aren't able to have that conversation, they will feel very validated just by your noticing, just by you giving voice to what you're seeing. It really, really can help them feel seen and heard. Okay. I also want to say on this sort of like general tips list, something that I keep coming back to is how we can be really honest with our kids when they're asking questions. If you don't know the answer or haven't solidified your ideas around that answer, it's okay to say, I don't know. And it's okay to say that about anything. I know so many of us who are in this homeschool world now, our kids are asking questions, academic questions that we legitimately don't know the answer to. If you're friends with me on Facebook, you will see that I yelled last week, I don't know how to solve that problem using a number line. And my 9-year-old was like, you're so dumb. But it's true. And we can do that in this area as well. If our kids are asking us questions that you really don't have the answer to, you can say, I don't know the answer to that. Let's find out together. And showing that vulnerability yourself and being able to engage in finding an answer together, that's a really powerful bonding parental moment, right? So I would encourage us to do that.
Thanks, Sarah. I want to remind us that it's vital for us as grown-ups to get clear with ourselves about our own values as we figure out what we want to talk about with kids. It's an opportunity for us to think about what we might have learned growing up that didn't work for us, that doesn't work for us, and how we think about things now, how we want our kids to learn about one of life's hardest topics from us, the grown-ups in their lives. For example, if we grew up learning that everyone's going to go to heaven if we behave well, but that idea doesn't work for us, what might work better? It's important to try to have these conversations at the adult level after the kids go to sleep also. If you're partnered, getting out your differences and coming up with ways you can agree to talk about with your kids is important. Being honest. Mommy grew up learning X while Ema grew up learning Y, and now we both think Z. God is an abstract concept for kids and for most grown-ups too. I'll get to the God talk in a little while though.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important for us. And, you know, there's so many issues that seem taboo. Go there now. Like, do it now. Engage in it now. Great. So now we're going to look a little bit more at this ages and stages piece. And so many of your hundreds of questions were really specifically about how do I talk to my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12-year-olds about this. And so we put together some ideas that help us remember what is happening developmentally with kids of all these different ages. But I want to say as well that it's not a one size fits all. It's like buying clothes for your kids that are sized by age, right? Like not every size 5T is going to fit every 5-year-old. We know that, right? I don't know why clothes are sized that way, but it's for this as well, that you have to know your kid and sort of where they fall in this spectrum. But we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of what might be happening for your child in these ages. So for our toddlers and preschoolers, toddlers and preschoolers really see death as temporary. They don't have the same kind of concepts quite yet of finality that we do as adults. They're very concrete thinkers. And, children of all ages really are absolutists, but especially our very youngest. And they're being asked to live right now with so much ambiguity, and it is really, really hard. So how can we address these kind of issues with kids this age? I think Melanie was speaking to this just a little bit, but especially for our youngest children, our language really matters. We need to avoid euphemisms when talking about death and loss with even our youngest children. You know, we might think it softens the blow a little bit to use language like passed away or gone somewhere better, or whatever the language you may have been using. But it's very, very confusing for our youngest children. And I encourage us all to figure out some clear language that really works for you about how you can have these conversations, and we'll continue to talk about it, but really to use clear clinical language, just like we teach kids this, you're talking about this too, Melanie, like clear and clinical language around body parts is really important for young kids. And we have to do it around death and loss as well. As our kids get a little bit older, elementary age kids, they do come to understand the finality of death. They've seen it with animals, with pets, and those who've experienced loss in their own circle of friends and family. They really do understand that concept. So often the questions that children this age really have around death are, what's gonna happen to me if you die? What's gonna happen? They're very self-centered, and developmentally appropriately so. That's just where they are in their evolution of figuring out how to be a human being. Children this age are very into themselves. And so there are many fears around this idea of, if my parents die, it's not about that they're gonna be sad or miss you necessarily, although I'm sure they will, but who's gonna take care of me? Who's gonna cook me dinner? And we were hearing those kind of questions come in from you all too, saying, my kids are asking these questions about, you know, if you die, who am I going to live with? Someone who had a young child said, if you die, who's going to tie my shoes? So these questions may seem cold to us. They may seem a little bit callous because they don't seem like they're questions about real emotional depth and caring. But this is just who our kids are right now at this age. And this is how they're making sense of their world. They're trying to navigate, what will my day-to-day life look like if the person who makes my lunch isn't here? If the person who ties my shoes isn't here? We need to reassure them, especially around this issue, that no matter what happens, there will be people who will take care of them. So to engage in those kind of conversations and be really clear with your answers. Both for our toddlers and our preschoolers and our elementary age kids, I want to make sure we remember that when we're having these conversations, we are only answering the questions that our children are asking. I want to repeat that. Only answer the exact questions, really, that your children are asking. We come to this issue of death and grief and loss with so much baggage as adults, and our kids don't have that. Our kids are not us. We can't assume that their feelings and questions about these issues are going to be the same as ours are. If they're asking very specific questions about what happens to a person when they die, they're most likely not asking a spiritual, ephemeral kind of question. They're asking, like, they go in a box, they go in the ground. They're asking really, really specific kind of physically connected questions. So let's make sure when we're engaging in these kind of conversations that we're listening really carefully to the question and answering that question, and to remind ourselves that this isn't your only opportunity. Having this conversation is not a one-shot deal. We're gonna keep having it over and over again. We're gonna keep using different language. We're gonna answer different questions. So you don't have to feel the pressure to get everything out that you're feeling and thinking in one conversation. Answer the question, check in with your child, say, does that answer your question? Make sure it does. Ask if they have additional questions, and then you can move on. And it's also totally appropriate if you answer what seems like a difficult question, and then your kid says, okay, I'm gonna go ride my bike. Like, that's okay. they're processing in their own way, they got an answer, and they're moving on to something else. And then this next piece, for our older kids, for our tweens and young teens, they really understand death in the same way many of us do as adults. They understand the finality of it. They understand a lot of the physical pieces of it, what causes death, that death is not reversible, that death is permanent and finite, that it happens to everyone. But what tweens and teens are really struggling with in all aspects of their lives are how to handle their feelings. We see this even when we're not in a time of crisis, that kids this age don't know what to do with all of the feelings they're having. And in reaction to something that's challenging like this, there's a lot really that's bubbling over around it. And there can be feelings of guilt connected to loss and death for older elementary and teens and tweens. These ideas that something they did may have impacted or caused a death. There are a lot of feelings of regret among teens and tweens about this as well. They have that permanence thing, and they know that if they lost someone, they missed out on doing X, Y, and Z with them. And they're really struggling with that, really grappling with that. And similar to us as adults, they're little philosophers in a way. They're thinking deeply about what it means. They're struggling with these ideas of why do good things happen to bad people? Why do bad things happen to good people? They're trying to hold these two things at the same time. They are, struggling with ideas of, so what is life, how is life worth it if this is the end? They're really struggling with these things. So I think that gives us a little bit of a handle on maybe where we all are in terms of that. I hope that is a framework that is helpful in answering some more of our questions and moving on. I just wanted to share one little anecdote before I hand it back to Melanie. As I was looking at these questions and I was thinking about all this developmental stuff, I was of course thinking very much about my own kids. And I was remembering my mom's partner passed away actually 4 years ago today. And my son at the time was just 3. And, my husband and I were really struggling with how to have these conversations with our kids because he was a grandparent to our children. And, we had our own emotional baggage around all of this. We were having these conversations with our kids, and Miles just said to us, he's like, oh, so he's dead and he's gonna go on the ground and he has bones like a dinosaur. So maybe he will be a fossil one day. That was his construct of that idea. He was a 3-year-old boy obsessed with dinosaurs. And I said, yeah, you're right. That makes perfect sense. So whatever our children are saying or asking, it makes sense. They're making sense of it in their world. They're connecting it to what they're interested in and what they have knowledge about. That's how we all construct our knowledge base. We take something we already know, we add a little bit more to it, and it helps it make sense. And that's where our kids are going to be with this right now.
Yeah, I love that story, Sarah. Kids are so literal and they're amazing at processing things by associating what they can't quite comprehend with what they already know. Of course, kids know that dinosaurs died and archaeologists find their bones. I want to add a little bit more about the language, since we received so many questions about it, the language that we use when talking with kids. I want to be an advocate for using the words dead, death, and dying with kids as soon as you're talking about these things with kids. I'm not a fan of saying passed away, even as I recognize that this is what so many of us were raised with. What does it mean to pass away? How do you explain that? It's unclear. And please don't talk about going to sleep forever. we all need sleep, and most of us will get to wake up again tomorrow. Sleep is healthy, sleep is restorative. Good sleep promotes longer lives. We've even got Jewish rituals we can do with kids around going to sleep and around waking up, rituals to express gratitude at the end of the day and at the beginning of each day. There have been a number of PJ Library books about that too. So death shouldn't be equated with sleep. Sleep is a temporary state, death is permanent. Another challenge we have as parents is in how children's media portrays death. We received some questions about this as well. Certainly the movies Frozen and Frozen 2, as amazing as they are as movies, didn't help our cause. We need to help kids understand that when people die, they don't come back to life. An example of a positive portrayal of death in kids' media is the movie Coco, which may be for older kids, where we learn about another culture's treatment of death and a holiday all about remembering. When it comes to deaths that have happened in unusual circumstances, which we also received questions about, with younger kids, we don't necessarily need to dig deeply about all of the reasons, because sometimes there aren't answers to all of their questions or all of our questions, but we can talk about the people who are left behind, about what we can do to support someone who's experienced someone they love dying, whether it's paying a Shiva call when we can gather in person, or visiting by Zoom now when online Shiva is the norm, or by sending a card or some food, even in our current situation. We had some questions from folks about how to talk about things like suicide or dying from drug abuse or accidental deaths like drownings. And we recognize that the current situation is bringing up a lot of trauma in general around death. So first, I want to thank the people who posed those questions, because there's entirely too much silence around those issues, especially in the Jewish community. And I also want to name that we received a number of questions from grandparents. We see so many of you here with us today. So a big shout out to all of you grandparents who are joining us today. We hear you, and we're so grateful that you're here. We encourage you to spend more time than usual telling your stories to your grandkids. Write them down. Send your kids and your grandkids letters. Write them emails, even if they can't read yet. Record your voice. Hit record on your family's Zoom celebrations of birthdays. Think about those of us who have slides or movies or VHS tapes or something that shows people that you can hear people who are no longer living in your own family. What are those things that we can create for our kids and our grandkids? For grandparents especially, Google how to write an ethical will. Look at sites like lifeposts.com. Take the time to document your values. What's important to you? Where do you give your charity? How have you spent your time outside of work and family? And your hopes for how your descendants might learn from your stories. Make picture books from the boxes you have of old photographs. You can scan them and upload them online now and then get the book delivered. Create the mementos you want handed down to the next generation if you make an art project with your grandkids online now. And the last thing I want to talk about for the moment is the God talk. We received a good number of questions about how to talk about death and God, about heaven, about Bubby going to be with Hashem, a Hebrew word for God, about how God could possibly allow horrible things to happen, like COVID-19, like the death of the people we love the most. We've also received a number of questions, similarly, about how to reconcile differing faith traditions among parents and extended family members in interfaith families. PJ Library loves our interfaith families. We welcome all families raising Jewish children. There's certainly some good children's books out there, some by PJ Library authors, some of which we'll share with you on book lists and links that will be available after the webinar. I want to make the point that when we share what we believe with our kids, we model for them what it can look like to figure out what they believe, even when we may not have all the answers, right? I'm not exactly sure what happened to Bubby's soul. Here's what I think. Yes, we were at the cemetery when Bubby's body went into the ground, right? But I'm not sure about her soul. What do you think? And then we have a conversation in which we get a little bit closer to an answer, or the inability to answer, that we can live with for the moment.
Oh, Melanie, thank you. I'm so fortunate to have you as a colleague and be able to have this conversation with you, because all of those points are so important and give us great tips on how to continue navigating this really, really challenging stuff. My fabulous colleagues are feeding me a few questions that I'd like to be able to address in our, oh my goodness, last 15 minutes together. We're really good at talking. This is a question that's been repeated a lot, and we saw in the questions that were submitted, and Carla's highlighting it for me as well, asking, isn't talking like this with our kids going to keep them up at night? That's such a good question. There's so much keeping me up at night right now, but this isn't it, actually. And I don't think it is for our kids either. When we're able to have really open and honest and factual conversations with our kids, we actually really allay a lot of their anxiety. There's so much more anxiety in all of us, but especially with our kids, about the things that are unsaid. Our children worry so much more about the unknown than the known. If we're able to clarify some fears, if we're able to give voice and language to some of the stuff that our kids are really struggling with, it can really, really help. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I think for some of us, we have kids who have trouble falling asleep at night, and we have kids who have trouble staying asleep at night. And some of us have kids who are regressing and coming into our beds after many years of sleeping independently. And so for those of us in that kind of situation, it's important to think about when else we might want to bring up a hard topic that can leave us with some unresolved feelings or bring up some fears that might make it harder to go to sleep. So those are the kinds of conversations, you mentioned like driving carpool, and the kids in the back seat. In an urban setting, our equivalent is like when we take a walk outside and we walk, to see some trees and flowers. It's not face to face. We don't have that eye contact, and it lowers some of the pressure that we can talk side by side, and sometimes even holding hands, that we have that physical connection, or if we're sitting on the couch next to one another, right? And so like we're able to touch and to snuggle. Sometimes that physical stuff helps to lower some of the feelings also. And so I really think it's important to find other times of day to bring it up if you're in a family where sleep is an issue.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Melanie. And I think too, what you're saying about that physical connection, I'm really interested in our brain chemistry and how it works in these kind of situations. And, when we have those close physical connections, our brains are flooded with good chemicals like dopamine and serotonin, and sort of offset the brain chemicals that make us more anxious. So there's real science behind that. We know it feels good, and there's a reason for that. Something you just said too, Melanie, which I don't know if I touched on as much as I had hoped to earlier, is this idea around regression. I think so many of us are seeing this with our kids right now, and we're having a lot of questions about that. And here's what we know from, a child development place, that regression is a way that we return back to a time that felt safer. We're regressing, we're going backwards to when we felt safer. So if your kids are exhibiting behavior that seems very young for them, if they're going back to sucking their thumb, if they're going back to coming into your bed in the middle of the night, if they're having tantrums in a way they haven't had since they were much younger, it's very developmentally appropriate. It's okay, and it will pass. They are really struggling, and their defense mechanism in this arena is to find a place that felt safe and comfortable. And there are parts about being younger and in behavior that is very known that is calming for them. So just to say, like, it's okay that our kids are doing that. And don't judge them. Don't use language to say like, you're really acting like a baby. Please don't say that. Just hug them, just snuggle them if you're able to. And don't chastise them for sucking their thumb. Don't kick them out of bed. Really, it will pass. And we need to give them as much of our nourishment as we possibly can during this time.
Yeah, something I've been thinking about on that is like, we also were, because we're in crisis and we're living in fear, we're losing our ability to remind ourselves how we've gotten help on these things in the past. So, you know, it finally occurred to me yesterday to email the pediatrician. Duh! Like, you know, this is what we're seeing with sleep. I know it's been a few years since we talked about sleep. And it was a really helpful consult, which we did by email or could have done by phone. So, you know, a reminder for us to use the folks who are in our networks, and that it's not permanent. I want to say something about the current situation not being a permanent situation. We don't know what the future holds. And when we talk about death and dying as a result of the coronavirus, not everyone is dying from it. And so I just wanted to lift that up, that most people who have gotten it haven't died from it. And so that often can provide some sense of relief, even for ourselves as adults.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to feed in a few more questions here, and Meredith, Carla, if you see some more that you'd like us to address in the next 10 minutes, please let us know. This one, I think, is really on a lot of our minds. What should I do if my kids aren't talking about this at all? Should I bring it up? Should I try to stay positive? Should we have like the big talk? I think in terms of your kids aren't talking about it at all, they might not be talking about it literally. They might not literally be saying, I'm afraid of X, Y, and Z, or I'm feeling this kind of loss. But I would encourage you to check in around their behavior and other things they're talking about. And that is an entree into having this conversation. I don't encourage us to sit down at the table and say like, hey kids, let's talk about death and dying. That is not going to work for us. You have to work it into questions and conversations that are already being had. And like I was saying, it's about this constructivist kind of model of your kids know a little bit and they need to know a little bit more. We're going to give them a little bit more that will then bring us to this next place. So I think if they're not bringing it up at all, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I also want to say to you, like, if you're having big feelings about this as a grown-up, you can talk about it. You can talk about it with your family, and not to push on your kids, but to say like, guys, I'm feeling really sad. I'm feeling really scared. And I have to say what a gift that is to give your children, to show your own vulnerability, to show them that it's okay to be scared, it's okay to be sad, and that they can exhibit that as well. So some of our kids may not be showing that because they're not sure how to negotiate those feelings because they haven't seen it modeled so much. So I hope that sort of answers that question a little bit. Melanie, anything else on that one you might want to add?
Let's take the next question.
Okay. I'm getting very pinpointed questions from my 5-year-old about what happens after death. For example, why can't we come back? How do you communicate if you don't have a body anymore? I have no clue what the Jewish faith says on these things. So I think this sort of comes back to what Melanie was saying a little bit before, is like, check yourself before you wreck yourself. Like, make sure you know how you feel about this thing. And if you're raising children with a partner, if you're co-parenting with another adult who doesn't live with you, you still need to be in conversation with that other grown-up and say, what is the language we're going to use here with our kids? It's also okay if you feel different things. If you have a partner or an ex who has different feelings, it's okay to say, like you were saying, like, Ima thinks this thing and Mama thinks this. Like, that's okay. We can let our kids navigate that.
Yeah, I want to lift up part of that question is I have no idea what Jewish tradition says about this, right? And so many of us find ourselves in places where we're raising Jewish children, but we don't have the answers that we think we should have about, you know, what does Judaism say? How do I have to do this? What's the right thing to say? And that's okay, because sometimes there aren't answers, and sometimes there are a lot more than just one answer about it. So the whole idea of afterlife goes back to what I said earlier about rabbinic imaginations, right? Like, we can only only imagine what it might be like after death. And that's certainly an age level conversation to ask open-ended questions. That's such a great question. What do you think about that? And hear where the child is. Where's that question coming from? I think about it in the ways that we fish for information when our kids aren't talking about things. Going back to the earlier question, in my family, my kids are a little bit older. After a school shooting, after an anti-Semitic incident, I'm so curious. There was a lot going on in the news today. Did anything come up at school? Right? And then to hear from kids what's on their minds, what they've heard from others, and then be able to address that. Same thing with the afterlife question, what they're seeing on cartoons in particular.
Great. I think I would say exactly the same thing. So I'm not even going to say anymore. We have lots and lots of, so we're PJ Library. We are the book people, lots of questions about books. We're going to send along, we have resources on the PJ Library website that we are constantly evolving, both around coronavirus resources in general, around resources around how to talk to our kids about death and dying, and specifically resources that are books that help address this subject. So I don't want to just speak the names of those books right now because I know I'm going to leave some out. So keep an eye out later this week. We're going to send you a recording of this webinar, a whole beautiful packet of resources that includes links to book lists and things like that. There's a great book list recently back in December from the New York Times that has great books for kids, and we have lists on our website as well. So we'll make sure all of that comes to you. And I want to say, Melanie, you're saying just don't forget about the resources we already have in our lives. If you really feel like you or your family are in real crisis, reach out to your physical and mental health practitioners. They're there for you. My friends who are physicians and therapists are really encouraging us to do this. Like, yes, you may be afraid to go to a doctor's office or the hospital, but they're all doing telehealth and they're there for you and they want to support you through this crisis. Even if you or your child is in a challenging place with your mental health that you haven't been before, please find some help. And we'll send resources for that as well that are both local and national, international, that are both Jewish and secular, that can really help you navigate those kind of challenging things right now. And, again, with all these things, I just say, please don't have shame around it. Please don't think it's taboo, and know that it will only do better for you to really engage in that. I'm just going to do one final scroll. Sarah,
can I pop in one question? Hi, it's Meredith. We've gotten a lot of questions about losses that aren't specifically death, right? And I would say ranging from, how do I explain it? But I think specifically in this conversation, are the feelings going to be similar to grief, right? Do I approach it the same way, or do I approach it as a different type of conversation?
Thanks, Meredith. Like I was saying a little bit at the beginning, our brains have a hard time sometimes differentiating between these different types of loss, especially if you come at loss with a lot of previous baggage. And to say those feelings that we and our children are having that you say, that feels like grief. It is grief. Even if it isn't a death, it is grief. We process loss of these kind of events in a very similar way. And there's a great piece put out by the URJ last week that really addressed the Union for Reform Judaism, that really specifically addressed the loss of summer camp, but it was a great framework for talking with our children about the programming and events and school that they're missing out on, and some great language to frame that. So we'll be sure to send you that, and to say, just keep talking about it. Keep validating whatever it is that your children are expressing. Make sure that you are clearly articulating your feelings as well. Model for the people you love that it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to not know. It's so incredibly valuable for your children and for the people around you to be in an open and honest relationship that allows for vulnerability and conversations. So, Melanie, oh my goodness. Thank you for your time today and for the many hours of your time leading into this. Thank you so much to our colleagues at PJ Library who are here with us today, especially to Meredith and Carla and Duncan who helped us navigate this conversation. Thank you to all of our staff that we work with at PJ Library that helped us bring this to you today, and just for allowing us to have the space to have these kind of challenging conversations. Thank you for joining us, and we just wish you continued health and calm. Try to find it if you can. Thank you so much.